I was dressed for my son's wedding. Hair, curled shoes, polished hands, trembling just enough to feel like a mother on the edge of a proud day. But pride has a sharp side when no one looks at you, when your name is misspelled on the seating chart, when your presence is barely tolerated. The worst part wasn't being forgotten. It was being erased while still breathing, still standing. And when the bride leaned in with that practiced smile and said the words, I knew I was no longer part of the family photo, not even the edge of the frame. I found my name Ramona, with one letter wrong printed on the last table near the exit doors. Table 11. The napkin on my place setting was folded into a swan, same as the others. But I could tell someone had done it in a rush. There was a smear of lipstick on the water glass. No one else was seated yet. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to sit or wait. Everyone else was moving through the garden space, laughing, greeting each other like family. They looked past me. No eye contact. I wasn't expecting a spotlight, but I had expected a hello. Miles walked past me once. His tie was slightly crooked, and his shoes looked new. He didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. Just a half smile aimed at someone behind me. I took my seat. The music started. The guests were asked to rise. I followed. I tried to make myself invisible without disappearing. Marcy entered like she belonged on a magazine cover. Lace from shoulder to ankle hair swept low and pinned with tiny pearls. Her mother wiped away a tear. Her father stood proud and still. Then Marcy's eyes scanned the crowd. She saw me. I know she saw me. Later during the photos, I stepped near the edge of the group. Not too close, just enough to be nearby if someone remembered. That's when she walked over. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't frown. She simply said, You're lovely, but this moment is for close family only. Maybe you'd be more comfortable elsewhere. I nodded. That was all. There was no scene, no gasp, no protest. Just a quiet acceptance and the slow realization that I wasn't part of this story anymore. Let me ask you something. Have you ever shown up for someone with your whole heart and still been treated like a stranger in the room? If you know that feeling, the one where your presence becomes an inconvenience, then maybe, just maybe, you understand what happened to me that day. And what happened after. Left before dessert. No one stopped me. The valet handed me my keys without a word, and I drove myself home through winding hills, past vineyards lit with soft golden light. The road blurred a little, but not from tears, just the weight of something closing. At the first red light, I turned off the music. I didn't want noise. I needed the kind of silence that lets the mind stretch out and fold over itself. That kind of silence is rare and heavy. It fills the car until it becomes something solid you carry with you. Back home, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I placed my purse on the kitchen table, slipped off my shoes, and stood by the sink. I looked out into the darkness behind the window and saw only my own reflection. Hair pinned back, lipstick, fading shoulders, slightly slouched. I looked like someone who had waited for too long. I poured a glass of water and sat in the armchair where I used to read to Miles. That room had held so many versions of him. The toddler who lined up blocks in straight rows, the teenager who slammed doors, the college freshman who came home with bags of laundry and stories about dorm life. Each version of him had passed through here, and now the air felt like it had let go of his presence completely. I opened the drawer of the end table beside me. Inside were the birthday cards he used to make, colored in crayon, sometimes scribbled with jokes only a child would find funny. One card had a drawing of me wearing a crown. Queen Mum, it said, with a crooked heart drawn beside it. I ran my finger over the paper. The edges had started to yellow. Later that night, I took off the dress, hung it back in the garment bag, and placed it at the far end of the closet. I didn't cry, not because I didn't want to, but because there was nothing left inside that demanded release. I had been let go, quietly, not with anger, not with shame, just released like someone who didn't belong at the table anymore. Before bed, I made tea and stood by the window again. The street was quiet. One porch light across the way flickered, then steadied. I imagined other families finishing their meals, tucking in children, folding laundry. I used to be part of that rhythm. Now I was somewhere else. Not outside. Not forgotten. But no longer invited in. I carried that stillness to bed, pulled the covers up, and let the silence lie beside me. And when I finally closed my eyes, it was not sleep that came first. It was absence, complete and whole. 2 days passed without a call. I didn't expect one, but some part of me kept checking the phone anyway. The house was too quiet, even with the windows open. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt staged, like something had been removed. On the third morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and the same notebook I used for grocery lists. I hadn't written in it since before the wedding. I flipped past old notes and came across a page I had once used to jot down reminders. Among them, circled faintly in pencil, was a phrase, "If she doesn't know, it won't matter." It stopped me. The handwriting was mine, written quick and crooked during the engagement party 6 months earlier. I had almost forgotten I heard it. It was late in the evening just before I left. I had gone out to the patio to find my coat and overheard two voices on the other side of the garden wall. One male, one unsure. The words had drifted through the air like smoke. I didn't recognize the voice then, and I still didn't now. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I assumed they were talking about guest lists or maybe an awkward family situation. But now the memory felt sharp, too deliberate to be about party planning. I put down the pen and closed the notebook. That phrase had come back for a reason. That same night, I went into the spare room where I kept old papers. Stacks of letters, envelopes, holiday cards. Things I hadn't looked at in years. I pulled out a file marked Miles and began flipping through. Among the usual papers, I found a thank you note from him after college graduation, a card from Marcy sent around their second anniversary. But tucked in the back was a printed email, one I must have saved without thinking. It was a forwarded document with travel plans from months ago. What caught my eye wasn't the message itself. It was the name of the account that sent it. A financial planning address not linked to either of them by name. But the footer included a business logo I didn't recognize. I took out my laptop and searched it. The company had dissolved 8 months ago. No website, no public information, only a few traces in online business directories. Still, I wrote it down. The timing sat uncomfortably close to the engagement. Later that night, I sat with the notebook again. I flipped back to the phrase, "If she doesn't know, it won't matter." What was I not meant to know? And why had they worked so hard to keep it that way? The thought settled like dust in the room. It didn't make a sound, but it stayed. And from that moment on, I stopped waiting for an apology. I started looking for the truth. I spent that Sunday in silence. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't play music. I needed to hear myself think. The phrase from the engagement party stayed in my head like a slow drip from a faucet you can't quite fix. If she doesn't know, it won't matter. But something about it did matter. Enough to pull me back to a part of myself I had left behind. By late afternoon, I found myself in the back room, standing in front of the old filing cabinet I hadn't touched in years. The bottom drawer stuck like it always had. Inside were 2 faded shoeboxes and an accordion folder. I took everything out and spread it across the dining table. One box held birthday cards from Miles. The other envelopes from the bank, postmarked years ago. The accordion folder was heavier. I flipped it open and found statements, contracts, even a scan of the original deed to the house. As I skimmed through each paper, my eye caught a transaction I didn't recognize. 9 months ago. A transfer from a joint account Miles had access to back when we handled some shared paperwork for my home. The recipient's name meant nothing to me, but the amount stood out. Too large to be casual, too precise to be accidental. I pulled my laptop from the shelf and searched the name. Nothing came up. No business, no person. Just a few scattered hits from search engines that led nowhere. I typed it again, adding a state and a zip code. Still nothing. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. A long time ago, when I worked in community reporting, I'd been trained to follow inconsistencies, not the loud ones, but the small ones, the ones that don't want to be noticed, the kinds that live in footnotes and fine print. This transfer felt like that. That evening, I revisited old emails. Most of them were short, some about flight times, others about birthdays or rescheduling holidays. But when I looked closer, the tone had been changing for a while. Where there used to be warmth, there were now bullet points, dates, logistics, no affection. I opened the wedding invitation again. My name was printed without any title. Just Ramona Fields. Not Mum, not even Mrs. Fields. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it read like an omission with intent. These weren't single slights. They were pieces of something larger. Before bed, I wrote down everything I had found. I listed the date of the wire transfer, the email it followed, the name on the transaction. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew what it felt like. A door had been closing behind me for a long time, and I had only just turned around to see it. I woke before sunrise the next morning, pulled the curtains halfway, and sat at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee. The name from the wire transfer still echoed in my head. It wasn't familiar, and it wasn't random. I knew that much. I opened a notebook and wrote down everything I remembered about Marcy, not her wedding dress or her favorite flowers. I focused on facts. The college she went to, the job Miles once told me she had before they moved, the name he mentioned once when they first started dating. Back then, he had called her Maggie, not Marcy. I pulled out my old laptop. It took a while to power up. I had kept it mostly for tax records and old photos, but it still had a few saved email threads from years ago. I found one where Miles had forwarded me an early holiday card draft. He had attached a scanned image with their names printed together. Miles Fields and Margaret Lane. That was nearly 8 months before the engagement. I ran a search on the name Margaret Lane. A few results came up. A woman with that name had filed for a legal name change in California just over 7 months ago. The new name was Marcella L. Fields. I read the public record 3 times before it sank in. She hadn't just changed her last name after marriage. She had changed her entire name before the wedding. I didn't know why that unsettled me so deeply. Maybe because it meant something had been erased. Maybe because it wasn't just a cosmetic change. It was a reintroduction. A woman choosing to become someone else on paper before joining our family. That same afternoon, I searched for more details tied to the name Margaret Lane. One of the older links led to a court filing from a dissolved company. Not a criminal case, but a financial audit that suggested mismanagement. Offshore accounts, suspicious transactions. The company had been dissolved quietly. The owner listed was a man named Gerald Lane. I remembered him. He had stood beside Marcy at the rehearsal dinner, a tall man with expensive shoes and a voice like glass. She had introduced him as an uncle. But the name matched the court record, and the timeline matched the name change. I closed the laptop and leaned back. This wasn't about a mother being forgotten at a wedding. This was about something else entirely. A family that had erased part of its past and rebuilt it under new names, and my son had married into it. Whatever I had sensed before wasn't just hurt feelings, it was instinct. And now that instinct had a shape. Not clear, not complete, but no longer imagined. It had been 5 years since Miles first asked to borrow the deed to the house. He said it was just for a short time. Some kind of collateral arrangement with the bank, nothing permanent. Back then, I didn't ask too many questions. He was calm, confident, and made it sound routine. The papers came in a folder with printed tabs. He had highlighted where I needed to sign. I remembered feeling a little uneasy, but I signed anyway. He was my son. And at the time, I believed trust was something you gave without needing proof in return. Now I wasn't so sure. I went into the closet where I kept old legal documents and found the folder. The label was still the same, written in neat block letters. Property, temporary use. I opened it and flipped through the documents. The title page looked standard. So did the pages that followed. Until I reached one toward the back. A form with fine print. A power of attorney authorization limited but still binding. It had my name, my address, and a signature that looked like mine. Only I couldn't remember signing it. I stared at it for a long time. The date on the page was familiar. It was the same week I had been in the hospital after a fall. The same week Miles had brought me soup and sat by the window reading emails while I rested. I closed the folder. There was no immediate proof of wrongdoing, but there was a growing sense of something being used, something being moved behind my back. I wrote down the details, document numbers, file names, dates. Then I took out my checkbook and opened a new page in my notebook. At the bottom, I wrote a name I hadn't said aloud in a while. Sheila. She had been my husband's lawyer for years, retired now but still sharp, still precise. We hadn't spoken much since the funeral, but I had kept her number. I didn't know if she could help yet. But I needed someone who could see what I was starting to see. Not with emotion, but with clarity. I folded the papers back into the folder and placed it by the front door. Later that evening, I sat on the back porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger either. What I felt was distance. Not the kind that happens overnight, the kind that comes from slowly being moved out of your own story. One signature at a time. Sheila met me on a Tuesday afternoon. We sat in her small sunroom where the air smelled faintly of mint tea and old books. Her hair had gone fully white, but her eyes still carried that calm, exacting sharpness I remembered from my husband's probate meetings. I handed her the folder and watched her read in silence. She didn't rush. Her finger traced the text like someone reading in Braille, searching not just for what was written, but for what had been buried beneath it. When she finally looked up, she didn't soften the truth. The power of attorney was real. The signature was a close match, and the filing had been accepted without question by the county clerk. I asked her what it meant in plain terms. She said it meant I had granted my son the ability to use the property in my name, including for securing debts unless otherwise specified. There was no expiration date listed. And worse, no stipulation preventing transfer of ownership if the right documents were layered behind it. The word layered stuck in my head. I asked if it could be undone. She said it would take time, paperwork, possibly court involvement, but it wasn't hopeless. Before I left, she copied a few pages and placed them in a new folder. As she slid the last document inside, her hand paused. She pointed to a name listed as a witness on one of the back pages. Margaret Lane. I stared at it. Not Marcy. Not Marcella. Not even an initial. Margaret. It was the original name. The one I had found buried in old court filings and forgotten business registrations. The one from the engagement party days before everything changed. Sheila didn't ask how I knew it mattered. She just said, "This is what we start with." I thanked her and left with the folder pressed to my chest like a shield. Back home, I laid everything out on the dining table and took a long look. Pages of information, names I now recognized, timelines that made more sense when seen together. There was no single moment when the truth had hit me. It had arrived slowly through details, through the accumulation of silence and the reshaping of names. My house had become a pawn. My trust had been filed into someone else's strategy, and the woman who stood beside my son on his wedding day had once signed a document using a name she now pretended never existed. I lit a small lamp in the corner of the room. It wasn't for mood, it was so I could see clearly, because from this point forward I wasn't just following clues, I was following names. And now I had one. The knock came just after dusk. I hadn't been expecting anyone, and most people in the neighborhood didn't stop by unannounced. It was the kind of knock that didn't repeat. Steady, purposeful, but not aggressive. I opened the door halfway, keeping the chain hooked. Two men stood on the porch, both in their late 30s. One wore a dark windbreaker, the other a suit that didn't quite fit. Neither smiled. The man in the jacket spoke first. He said they were old friends of Miles just in town and hoping to check in on a few things he might have left with me. A few papers, he said, financial in nature. I asked their names. He gave them without hesitation. Neither matched anything I'd heard before. I told them I didn't have anything for Miles, and the taller one nodded as if that was expected. They didn't press. But before they turned to leave, the man in the suit glanced past me into the house. His eyes landed on the side table near the door. On it sat a closed folder, a different one than the documents from earlier, but still enough to draw attention. He tilted his head slightly, then smiled without teeth, just a line across his face, tight and deliberate. Then they left. I watched from the window as they walked back to their car. A black sedan parked too far from the curb. No stickers, no dents. The kind of car that didn't want to be remembered. That night I pulled out my old phone and scrolled through the wedding photos Miles had once shared with me in a family album. Not many were left. A few group shots, some posed moments. One photo froze my hand. It was taken on the lawn behind the reception. Marcy stood between two men. One was her father. The other was the man in the windbreaker. His hair was a bit longer then, but the eyes were the same. He hadn't been a friend of Miles. He had been part of Marcy's circle. And now he had come looking for something. I called Sheila first thing the next morning, told her what happened without embellishment. She listened, then asked if anything had been taken. I said no, nothing physical. But something had been left behind. A feeling I hadn't shaken since I closed the door. The feeling of being watched, not out of concern, but calculation. Sheila told me to gather every legal paper I had, to start a file that would be stored outside the house, just in case. I didn't argue. That afternoon, I went to the hardware store and bought a new lock. I also stopped by a notary's office to begin the process of reaffirming my property rights. When I got home, I shredded old junk mail, sealed the folder with my notes, and hid it in the back of the freezer. I knew now this wasn't just about silence. It was about leverage, and someone thought I had it. The next morning I opened the closet and pulled out the fireproof lockbox I hadn't touched in years. It held old insurance policies, marriage certificates, and the last. Will my husband signed before he passed. I added the folder with the suspicious documents, the printouts from the company registry, and the photo from the wedding, where the man in the windbreaker stood behind Marcy. Then I locked it, double-checked the key, and placed the box in the trunk of my car. Sheila had been clear. Keep the originals safe. Store copies off-site. If anything seemed out of place, act fast but quiet. No threats, no drama, just structure. I drove to a small storage unit 2 towns over and rented a narrow, climate-controlled space. I placed the lockbox in the back corner behind a plastic tub labelled holiday linens. On the way home, I stopped at a cafe and copied a short letter Sheila had helped me write. I signed 3 copies, folded them neatly, and sealed them in envelopes. The letter was not a threat. It was a boundary. It read in part that all property associated with my name had been reassigned into a protected trust established and reviewed by council. It listed the name of Sheila's firm. It included her contact information. And it ended with a single sentence. Any attempt to access, transfer, or claim these assets without proper process will be handled through legal channels. I mailed one to Marcy's parents' residence, one to the home Miles shared with her, and one to the family attorney Marcy had introduced at the rehearsal dinner, the man who gave a toast full of metaphors about unity and growth. By the time I arrived home, the sun had dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the porch. I made tea, sat in the kitchen, and listened to the soft hum of the refrigerator. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't angry. What I felt was stillness, a stillness born not from surrender but from control. I checked the locks again, then lit the porch light. Before bed, I called Sheila one more time and confirmed the documents had been scanned, dated, and stored securely on both paper and encrypted drive. She told me she was proud of how I handled it. I didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything to say. The next morning, I woke to an empty inbox. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to happen. Because now, whatever came next, would have to go through a door I had chosen to shut. And on the other side of it, I was no longer unprotected. I was prepared. 1 week later, a news story surfaced. Not a headline, not front-page material. Just a small piece tucked into the middle of a regional online publication. It mentioned the name of a charitable foundation linked to Marcy's father. A few irregularities in filings. Delayed financial disclosures. Quiet investigations reopened from previous audits. No accusations yet, but enough to stir attention. By the next afternoon, the story had been picked up by a few independent watchdog blogs. They dug deeper, found overlapping business addresses, names recycled through dissolved non-profits, connections between public funding and private property deals. No single detail incriminating on its own. But together, they told a story that didn't look clean. That evening, Marcy posted a photo on her social media account. She stood beside Miles in a perfectly curated kitchen holding a coffee mug. The caption read, "Building a life we're proud of. Family first." The kind of post designed to drown noise in Polish. But the comments told a different story. Someone had shared a link to the article. Then another person posted a screenshot of a court filing with her father's name. A few asked about the foundation mentioned in the investigation. One simply said, "This doesn't add up." Within hours, the post was deleted. Sheila texted me a single line that night. "It's beginning." The next day, a larger outlet picked up the thread. They didn't name Marcy or her father directly, but they quoted public documents and cited anonymous sources. The foundation suspended its activities pending review. A statement was released full of vague reassurances and future transparency. I said nothing. I didn't respond when a mutual acquaintance forwarded the story with a note asking if I had seen it. I didn't answer when a distant cousin called and left a voicemail wondering why I had been absent from the wedding photos. I made tea. I went for a walk. I watched the ripples move across the pond behind the library and thought about the difference between noise and consequence. By that weekend, the story had spread wide enough that a local television station mentioned it in passing. Just one segment, a 30-second update. But the name was spoken aloud, clear, unavoidable. It wasn't mine. And that was the first time in months I felt like I had reclaimed something. Not revenge, just space. The kind that forms when the truth surfaces on its own, and those who tried to silence it begin explaining themselves to people who were never supposed to ask questions. That night I didn't celebrate. I watered the plants. I folded a clean towel. I stood at the window and watched the lights across the street flicker behind curtains. And I understood something simple. There are times when silence is survival, but there are also times when being quiet lets the loudest lies collapse under their own weight. And this was one of those times. It was just past 7 when the phone rang. The sun was low, casting long strips of gold across the living room floor. I had just finished folding the last of the laundry when I saw Miles's name on the screen. We hadn't spoken in weeks. I answered without a word. He didn't say hello. He jumped in like a man already mid-conversation. He said the articles were unfair, that people were connecting dots that didn't belong together, that someone had started this someone with an agenda. His voice wasn't angry. It was tired, like he hadn't slept in days. Then he said something colder. He asked if I had anything to do with it. I let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of answer. He took a breath. Then he said Marcy was devastated, that her family was being hounded, that donors had pulled out, that they were considering legal action. Still, I said nothing. Finally, he asked the thing he really called for. He wanted me to make a statement, not to the press, he said, but just something written. Something that clarified I had no conflict with the family, that I supported the marriage, that anything surfacing now was coincidence. I sat down in the chair by the window and looked out at the street. Nothing moved out there. Not the trees, not the shadows. I told him no. I said it plainly without anger. Just the word placed like a stone in water. He paused. Then he shifted. Said he didn't understand what was happening. That he was trying to protect what he had built. That I was jeopardizing it. And I reminded him of something he once said to me. Long ago, before he left home. He had stood in the doorway with a backpack and told me he needed to find his own truth, that my protection was no longer what he needed. Now it was my turn. I told him I was doing the same. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't beg. But in the quiet that followed, I could feel the space widen between us. Something that used to hold now stretched thin. Before he hung up, he said one last thing. He said if I chose this path, not to expect invitations. I told him not to worry, because I had finally stopped waiting for them. 2 months later, I mailed off the final pages of a manuscript I hadn't intended to write. I called it Being Erased Quietly. It wasn't a memoir. Not really. It was a series of reflections, fragments of memory stitched with threads of truth that no longer fit anywhere else. I didn't use names. I didn't need to. It wasn't written to expose. It was written to remember. Some days I typed with steady hands. Other days I stopped halfway through a sentence and sat in silence, letting the weight of certain moments rise and settle before I continued. The writing didn't heal everything, but it gave shape to the ache. It put a frame around the things I refused to carry in secret anymore. My editor, a quiet woman in her 40s, wrote back after reading the first draft. She didn't ask for changes. She just said I felt her voice. That was enough. I spent more time outside after that. In the garden, at the local library, at a cafe down the block where no one knew me as Miles's mother. Just Ramona. I liked it that way. Not because I wanted to disappear, but because I finally existed without explanation. Marcy and Miles never contacted me again. No cards, no calls. I expected that. The story had already written its ending long before I began typing mine. Some people say closure looks like reunion, a hug, a tearful apology. Mine came in the form of silence. I chose not the silence that was forced on me. One morning, I walked past a row of houses with porches full of plants and wind chimes. I stood at a gate and let the wind touch my face. Then I turned home. Not bitter, not broken, just still, and finally whole. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. Maybe something in it mirrored your own quiet ache. Maybe you've known what it feels like to be edited out of a life you helped build. If so, know this. Your presence matters, your story deserves space, and your silence never meant weakness. If you feel ready to share your own story, or even just a thought, this Left Behind My Door is open, quietly but firmly.